A bright spot caught his eye. The stroller being pushed ahead stood out with its dazzling yellow color. The fabric of the stroller was adorned with naive sun illustrations, which only amplified the surreal feeling of the moment. Inside, a baby peacefully slept, its face expressing complete serenity, as if all the world's worries were alien to it. The woman standing nearby, likely the child's mother, seemed equally detached from her surroundings. She stood at a smoothie bar, her voice clearly audible as she ordered a drink with chia seeds. "Please add more chia," she said in a casual tone. Nearby, like a statue, stood a man, clutching a microwave box tightly. Suddenly, he felt paralyzed, as if a past he'd tried not to think about had materialized right before him. He should have turned and left, disappeared into the crowd, but instead he remained rooted to the spot. At that moment, the woman's gaze drifted towards him. What would happen next was anyone's guess. And then something happened that made time change its course. With unhurried grace, as if by chance, she scanned the space around her. But then her gaze landed on a row of seats, singled out my person, and our eyes met. In that fateful moment, the surrounding world, the hum of the mall, the appetizing smells of food, the ringing laughter of children, seemed to freeze in place, and then rapidly transformed, turning upside down. It's impossible to find words to convey the full range of emotions that overwhelmed me at that moment. Her lips, a second ago uttering phrases, suddenly froze, as if someone had paused life. The color instantly drained from her face, replaced by a sickly pallor, so rapidly that I feared she might faint right there in the middle of that noisy food court. She looked at me, as if a phantom from days gone by had appeared before her, and, admittedly, I felt exactly like such a ghost. My worn-out hoodie was soaked to the skin from the drizzle. A week's stubble unpleasantly pricked my skin, and an untied shoelace on my left boot only emphasized my messy and pathetic appearance. She, on the other hand, looked as if she had just stepped off the cover of a fashion magazine. Impeccably styled curls, a chic cardigan, and a smile that, a moment ago, seemed so sincere and vibrant, now twisted into a grimace of genuine horror. It had been a long 748 days since our last meeting. Yes, I had kept meticulous count, and here she stood before me, next to the child she had borne with another man. She desperately tried to say something, her lips moving erratically, but not a single word reached his ears. A deafening ringing filled his head, as if a funeral bell was striking the last beats of their shared past. Perhaps it was a quiet "oh," or a startled "my God," or maybe just a silent gasp, full of sudden terror. But he, strangely, understood perfectly what was going on in her head, what her gaze, full of confusion, was screaming. "What is he doing here? How dare he show up here?" Suddenly, he was overcome with a desire to laugh, hysterically and uncontrollably. Indeed, what was he doing here? In this mall, which had once served as their little haven, a refuge from grey weekdays and rainy weekends, a place where they spent hours wandering through shops and laughing at ridiculous jokes, the frozen yogurt shop was still in the same spot where she once, like a child, begged him for a double scoop of matcha. He clearly remembered that very corner where she, pressed against him between escalators, gave him a kiss, whispering a promise that now sounded like cruel mockery. "Swear we'll never break up, that we'll always be together." She broke that vow with ease in the middle of an ordinary work day, on a Wednesday afternoon. Without bothering to write or call, she simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only an empty house with 2 toothbrushes still standing in a glass in the bathroom, and a wedding ring carelessly tossed onto the coffee table. And a voicemail, beginning with a sickly sweet, "Please don't be angry," and ending with a chilling, "I'm not coming back." And now she stood before him, alive, thriving, like a symbol of new life, with a child born to another man. He didn't move, his feet seemingly rooted to the floor. Frozen, he watched her. How slowly, almost mechanically, she took the smoothie cup. How carefully, as if instinctively, she rocked the baby's stroller. The woman's gaze, full of nervousness and anxiety, darted restlessly around, as if she hoped he would disappear if she just squeezed her eyes shut hard enough. But he didn't disappear. He stood there, motionless, like an integral part of the mall, and this, it seemed, frightened her even more. Finally, he took a step forward. She instantly noticed the movement, her body tensing as if he had suddenly drawn a weapon, and she prepared for defense. The baby in the stroller, sensing the change in her state, stirred and let out a tiny whimper. The stroller creaked plaintively as she instinctively recoiled an inch, trying to increase the distance between them. When he spoke, his voice sounded alien, like old, cracked wood. It wasn't the witty retort he'd rehearsed in his head, nor the scathing insult meant to convey his pain. No, it was just one question, quiet, almost colorless, yet piercing. "Is that him?" Her eyes, moments ago full of terror, suddenly glistened as if tears had welled up. But they didn't fall. She didn't answer. However, an answer wasn't needed. He already knew it. It was etched in her eyes, in her tense posture. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she sharply turned away, her gaze fixed with feigned interest on a nearby shelf of scented candles, as if they were the most important thing in the world. The baby in the stroller happily cooed at that moment, completely unaware of the drama unfolding around him, while she continued to pretend that his question hadn't pierced through 2 years of agonizing, oppressive silence between them. He took another step forward, deliberately slow and measured. It wasn't about intimidating her. Such intentions were entirely absent. He was consumed only by a desperate desire for her to finally look at him as an equal, as a complete person, and not as an annoying oversight from the past, a long-forgotten and outgrown image of her. Her elegant fingers betrayed nervous tension, aimlessly fiddling with the edge of the smoothie cup, and her gaze kept darting towards the child, her child, as if she naively hoped that his innocent presence would miraculously distract the unwanted attention and make him retreat. But this ploy didn't work. His gaze, as if chained by invisible bonds, never left her, and his chest felt so constricted, as if he had swallowed a handful of sharp gravel, painfully scratching his insides. He repeated his question, this time even more slowly, articulating each word with agonizing clarity, as if giving her one last chance to hear, to understand. "Is that his child?" he said, nodding almost imperceptibly towards the stroller, not trusting himself to utter the name aloud. Curtis, even the thought of that name, those hateful syllables, still left a bitter taste in his mouth, like poison. She nodded barely, almost imperceptibly, as if afraid to move her head even a millimeter more than necessary, as if the slightest movement could shatter her fragile defense. In response, he made a ridiculous, unpleasant sound resembling laughter. It wasn't true laughter, not laughter of joy or even bitterness. It was more a manifestation of something that had finally broken inside him, something fragile and important, and this sound burst out like shards of broken glass. Several passers-by, drawn by the strange sound, turned, openly curious as they observed the scene. Mallory pulled her head into the collar of her oversized sweater, as if wishing to hide from prying eyes, her face expressing an undisguised desire for the ground to open up and swallow her, freeing her from unbearable shame. Suddenly, unable to hold back any longer, he blurted out, "This is too much, don't you think?" His voice, sounding overly sharp, echoed off the tiled walls of the food court, amplified to an unpleasant level. "You actually did it. You actually started a family with him. A real family, the one we once dreamed of." He looked down at the child in the stroller again. The baby had her eyes, large, deep azure, and in them, something excessively aware, too mature for his young age, was already visible. "I guess I was just a warm-up act for you, a rehearsal. Nothing more," he added, feeling bitterness rise in his throat. "Please don't," she finally whispered, her voice quiet, almost broken, worn, like old fabric, like an apology kept too long and stripped of all sincerity. She still didn't call him by name. Not Elwood, not even the impersonal you. Just don't. As if he wasn't a person, but some abstract threat, or even worse, just a ghostly echo of her past, which she so desperately tried to get rid of. He wanted to scream, desperately, to lose his voice, for the entire mall to witness his emotional pain. He wanted to destroy something insignificant and utterly useless, like a phone charger, or throw a tray of uneaten food. But instead, he just kept looking at her, his gaze full of unanswered questions. Why did you do it that way? Just disappear, without a single word of goodbye, without any warning. You didn't even bother to tell me to my face, in person." Her lips seemed to tremble in a silent attempt to speak, but the silence remained unbroken. Muteness enveloped her, as if words were stuck deep within her soul, unable to find their way into reality. The protagonist had often imagined this encounter, replaying all possible scenarios in his mind, under the cool streams of the shower, in the suffocating confinement of traffic jams, during sleepless nights on the saggy air mattress that had become his only refuge after she left. Thousands of perfect phrases, sharp retorts, and accusations were born in his head, but none could prepare him for this oppressive, stifling silence that had settled between them. A burning pain spread in his chest, and suddenly he realized that his breathing had stopped for almost 20 agonizing seconds, as if his body refused to live in her presence. "I didn't think you would ever let me go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You always held on to everything so tightly. People. Memories." With an uncertain gesture of her hand, she pointed towards him, as if he were an old, unpleasant habit she had finally shed, as if he were something that could simply be cast into the past. In a desperate attempt to find words that could put an end to this story, only a pathetic, pain-filled whisper escaped his lips. "I was your husband." This word, like a blow, like a slap, made her flinch. She instantly lowered her gaze, her hand mechanically, instinctively began to rock the stroller, as if trying to soothe not only the child, but herself. The baby in the stroller began to show signs of unrest, not yet crying, but already sensing the tension. And even at this crucial moment, she did not utter his name. The protagonist, consumed by bitterness and resentment, said with a catch in his voice, "Mallory, I would have done anything for you." Every word he spoke sounded like a reproach, a cry from a soul tormented by betrayal. He reminded her of the times when she, broken by depression, needed his support, when the world around her seemed grey and hopeless. He, without sparing effort, cleared out her mother's garage, while others remained indifferent. He spent hours honing her interview skills, instilling confidence in her abilities, even when she, as it now became clear, was already secretly exchanging messages with another, making plans behind his back. His words, like daggers, pierced her, forcing her to look up, a shadow of anger flashing in her eyes. "This isn't fair, is it?" he asked, giving her no chance to justify herself, because he remembered that fateful night when an unfamiliar scent of men's cologne emanated from her. He, naive, asked if it was a new shampoo. She, with an ironic smirk, replied that it was lavender, rolling her eyes as if he were a complete fool, unable to see the obvious. "I didn't want to hurt you," was her trite excuse. "But you did," he countered. "Unbearable, deep pain." Mallory gasped, and for a moment it seemed her perfect facade was about to crack. But of course it didn't. She always knew how to maintain her composure, especially in public, remaining unruffled, no matter the cost. And him. He was the guy who once cried uncontrollably in a parking lot, because the pharmacy didn't have the orange cough drops she loved so much. He was the one who begged her to come home, leaving endless voicemails while she was already building a new life with someone else. And now he stood in the middle of a mall, holding a box with a useless microwave, talking to a woman who once whispered "forever" in her sleep, while her new child, the fruit of her infidelity, tried to shove a plastic giraffe into his mouth. In that tragic moment, when it seemed things couldn't get worse, she uttered a phrase that cut deeper than any knife. "You look different." And that was all. No hint of sympathy, no word of regret, no acknowledgement of past merits or shared history, just a dry, soulless different, as if he weren't a person of flesh and blood, but merely an insignificant detail of the interior, like a new vase or rearranged paintings on a wall. At that moment, an irresistible urge to disappear, to dissolve into the grey gloom, as if he had never existed, overwhelmed him. And then he did something he hadn't planned at all. He simply turned around and walked away, without drama, without grand farewell speeches, without demonstrative gestures. He left, hunched under the burden of grief, holding that absurd box as if it contained the entire weight of the universe. He walked past the perfume shop window, emanating cloying scents, past the pretzel stand with its appetizing aromas, and exited through the automatic doors onto the street, where a dreary, grey rain was falling. And as those glass doors slowly, with a hiss, closed behind him, a strange, unexpected realization dawned on him. For the first time since that fateful day, she left his life. She was the one watching him leave, not the other way around. He was sure this was the end of their story, to walk away, to let those glass doors close behind him like a curtain falling after a humiliating, failed performance no one wanted to watch. He no longer expected anything from her. No words, no actions, no signs of attention. And he certainly didn't expect to hear the sound of quick, hurried footsteps splashing through puddles behind him. "Elwood, wait!" It was the first, long-awaited word, his name. Spoken by her in 2 long years, it sounded like a thunderclap, like a sudden lightning strike piercing the darkness of despair, under the wide awning at the mall entrance. As if petrified, he froze, tightly clutching the microwave box, as if this awkward burden could keep him from falling into the abyss of despair. He didn't turn around. His body refused to obey. Her steps caught up to him, her breathing ragged and heavy, as if after an exhausting marathon. With one hand, she shielded her eyes from the drizzling rain. With the other, she pressed her bulky cardigan to her chest, as if seeking protection from the chilly weather and from his gaze. The baby stroller, thankfully, remained inside the warm mall. Perhaps she had left it with one of the shop assistants, or perhaps, in her haste, she had simply forgotten it. He didn't know. His gaze was absorbed by the grey-soaked parking lot, the low, oppressive sky above it, the thin wisps of steam rising from the wet asphalt. For several long seconds she stood beside him, and her broken breathing was the only sound breaking the silence between them, as if reminding him of her sudden appearance. "You didn't look well," her quiet voice said through the rain, as if these words gave her the role of a heroine in this dramatic scene, as if her appearance here, in the drizzling rain, meant something more than 2 years of complete and utter non-existence. "You decided to check on me?" he asked with disbelief and bitterness in his voice, finally turning to her. "After you erased me from your life, as if I were an annoying typo that could simply be deleted." "I didn't do that," she countered, her voice weak. "You abandoned me, Mallory. Just vanished like a ghost." "I left a letter," came the reply, as if that were an exhaustive justification. "You left a formal document, Mallory, a set of instructions on how to live without you." She flinched, as if his words had caused her physical pain. For a moment, he almost felt guilty. Almost. Her hair, usually flawlessly styled, was now disheveled and wet from the rain, and dark streaks of mascara under one eye betrayingly revealed her distress. In that moment, she ceased to be the polished, seemingly perfect and unattainable Instagram diva. Before his eyes stood a person caught off guard by a storm of emotions, like a criminal caught in the act, desperately trying to piece together fleeting memories. And then it dawned on him. Perhaps she hadn't come here for him. Perhaps her visit was dictated by pangs of conscience, a desire to alleviate the burden of guilt. "I just couldn't face you, Elwood." Her voice was barely audible over the howling wind. "You would have talked me out of it. You would have convinced me to stay." These words, like a dagger's thrust, pierced his heart. "Damn right, I would have talked you out of it," he burst out, his voice trembling with pain and anger. "Because I, unlike you, believed in us, in our future. I thought you were just tired, confused, that you needed time. I couldn't imagine you were building a whole different life with someone who, damn it, drinks coffee out of a regular can." Suddenly, she let out a quiet, almost inaudible chuckle, a genuine, though muffled, sound. The sound made him feel physically sick. "You still do that?" she asked, wiping away smeared mascara under her eye. "Do what?" he asked, bewildered. "Make jokes when you're truly hurting, when your heart is broken." And at that moment, a wave of hatred washed over him. Not the tumultuous, cinematic hatred that portends a loud finale. This was something much quieter, deeper, and more agonizing. Hatred for a person who knew him too well, saw right through him, but had lost the right to that knowledge, ceased to be a part of his life. The protagonist looked out at the parking lot again, letting the biting rain and wind hit his face. His soaked hoodie offered no protection from the chilling cold that seemed to penetrate to his very bones. He spoke, without turning his head, in a flat, emotionless voice, addressing her. "And yet, Mallory, what brought you here? Were you afraid I'd throw myself under passing cars? Or did you just want to make sure I was still wearing my old sad shoes you so despised?" A heavy, prolonged silence followed. He thought she was about to retreat, leaving him alone with his tormenting thoughts. But the silence was broken by Mallory's barely audible voice. "Last month I had a nightmare. You were standing at the very edge of a pier, somewhere far away, without looking at me. You just stepped into the dark water and disappeared. When I woke up, I was gasping for breath, as if the world around me had collapsed overnight." The protagonist was speechless. For a few moments he stood, blinking helplessly, trying to wipe raindrops from his eyelashes, not knowing if it was moisture from the weather or tears he was desperately trying to hold back. With bitterness in his voice, he said, "Why do you suddenly care, Mallory?" "Because you were important to me. You still are important, just not in the way you'd want," she replied. Those words cut deeper than any slap. They were more bitter than the cursed letter, more bitter than every agonizing second of silence she had given him for 748 long days. The protagonist finally looked up and met her eyes. "Well, Mallory," he said softly, putting extreme, final resolve into every word. "You no longer get to decide how important I am in this world." And he just walked away. This time, she didn't follow him. He felt it, like a change in the air itself. It was resignation, an admission of defeat. Perhaps it finally dawned on her that you can't turn back time. You can't fix what was surgically removed from her life. You can't mourn what she slowly but surely destroyed with her own hands. In a trance-like state, he proceeded to his car, opened the door, and with particular care placed the microwave box on the seat beside him, as if transporting something fragile and priceless. A tremor seized his limbs and coursed through his entire body. In the rearview mirror, he could still see her figure, frozen in the cold rain. She watched motionlessly as he left her, her silhouette gradually diminishing. There was no doubt in his mind. This was the end of their story, the final scene, the curtain falling, and she, like an audience member, watched him leave from under the leaky roof of the mall, while he drove away with that ill-fated, sorrowful microwave, perhaps the saddest in all of North America. But, contrary to his expectations, fate had other plans. He realized this just 3 days later, when a letter appeared in his mailbox, with no return address, no envelope, just a folded piece of paper carelessly tucked into a torn sleeve of a children's greeting card, with cartoon raccoons. The message seemed to be written in haste, as if the pen barely kept up with the flow of thoughts. But the handwriting was painfully familiar, slanted, sharp, unmistakably hers, Mallory's handwriting. And across the top of the page, above the first sentence, were 5 words he would have given anything never to see, never to have appear in his life. "You don't know the half of it." For a long time, he watched those words. As if hypnotized, sitting on his unmade bed, he felt the letter seemingly weigh a ton in his trembling hand. In the corner of the room, the unopened microwave box served as a silent reminder of their recent encounter. Since that day at the mall, His diet had been limited to dry cereal, tasteless and lifeless, much like his own existence, and now Mallory, as if in defiance, was sending him these mysterious and unsettling messages, resembling either an absurd treasure hunt or a carefully planned trap. The first sentence made his stomach clench painfully. Curtis was never meant to be permanent. What could that mean? A fleeting fling? A temporary replacement? Was the father of her child just a temporary fixture in her life? She continued, explaining that the pregnancy was not her plan at all, and Curtis had insisted on the child, pressuring and convincing her. After the baby was born, their relationship turned out to be nothing like she had imagined. His former charm, infectious laughter, boundless energy of late-night hangouts, all of it vanished without a trace as soon as harsh reality intruded into their lives. She described in detail his change, how he started abusing alcohol, stopped listening to her, once disappeared for 2 days, and then returned with a black eye, offering no explanation. And finally, the moment came when he read the part of the letter that made him sit bolt upright, as if struck by lightning. "I've never told anyone this, Elwood, but when I left you I was already 3 months pregnant, and I wasn't sure if it was his." His hands shook so violently that the paper rustled like fallen leaves in an autumn park. The feeling that the world around him was losing its stability eventually made him drop the letter to the floor, lest he drop it from nervous trembling. He paced his humble abode like a cornered animal, finding no peace. 3 months, 3 agonizing months of uncertainty. That would mean there was a real, damn tangible chance. No, it couldn't be. It seemed too ridiculous, too cruel a twist of fate. Gathering the last remnants of his composure, he reached for the letter again, as if drawn by a magnet, irresistibly pulling him. The lines of the letter stated, "Curtis showed no doubt when I shared my fears with him. He was more pleased with the idea of fatherhood than the truth. He suggested that if we weren't sure, we would just tell everyone it was his child, and I didn't have the heart to stop him. I tried to bury that thought deep inside, convincing myself that the child was his. And maybe it is, but I no longer know how to believe it. And now, this question haunts me." The letter slipped from his weakened fingers and gently fell to the floor. He collapsed beside it, gazing at the refrigerator door, as if hoping to find answers to his tormenting questions there. His mind buzzed like a disturbed beehive, filled with fragments of thoughts, none of which brought the slightest clarity. Suddenly, the image of the baby he had seen in the stroller flashed in his mind. His eyes, those deep blue eyes he was used to seeing in the mirror when he looked at himself unadorned. This was no longer just a random, painful encounter at the mall. It wasn't just about her leaving him for a guy in a startup cardigan sipping coffee from a can. It was about a child, a small, defenseless being, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was his child. With painful interest, he picked up the ill-fated letter from the floor again. The rest of the message was a chaotic outpouring of regrets, admissions of her own mistakes, and a timid phrase about how sometimes she wondered what would have happened if she had told him the truth sooner, before their world completely collapsed. The concluding lines of the letter were written in a cold, detached tone. "I'm not asking for anything, just thought you deserved to know." Deserved to know? He wanted to scream at the top of his lungs, to shake the walls. He deserved much more than this pathetic, fragmented confession, carelessly tucked into a raccoon greeting card, likely bought at the nearest discount store. Despite the storm of bitterness and anger, he couldn't get it out of his head. This child he'd seen in the stroller, his toothless, genuine smile, those deep, sky-blue eyes. What if he, unknowingly, had walked past his own son? What if Mallory hadn't just left him, destroying their life together? What if she had taken his child with her, depriving him of the chance to know of his existence? He didn't sleep a wink that night, not a single minute. He sat on the edge of his bed, still dressed from his trip to the mall, rereading her letter again and again, until the words lost all meaning, turning into senseless symbols on paper. He might be yours. That phrase, like a broken record, constantly played in his head, a haunting melody he didn't ask to hear. This was no longer just betrayal, not just the pain of a breakup. This was something much deeper, something that pierced him to the core. He could have lost a child he didn't even know existed. And even worse, that child could have spent the last 2 years growing up in another man's family, calling him Dad, while he lived in ignorance and suffered alone. With the first glimmer of dawn, as pale sunbeams timidly penetrated through the slightly ajar blinds, he could no longer stay put within his apartment, tormented by agonizing thoughts. His gaze fell upon his old, dusty laptop, its keyboard bearing traces of past snacks, its casing adorned with naive stickers from the days when Mallory dreamed of being a blogger. Without losing a second, he opened his browser and typed a query into the search bar that, just a few hours earlier, would have seemed absurd to him. DNA paternity test without mother's consent. This query instantly dragged him into the dark abyss of the internet. He found forums populated by men just like him, ghost fathers, potential parents, ex-husbands whose lives had been overshadowed by another's lie. Many of them repeated the same mantra, as if in a conspiracy. Without legal rights, don't expect cooperation or truth. Most likely, you won't get them. But he wasn't looking for cooperation. At that moment, he desperately needed clarity, certainty, an answer to the question tormenting him. Since receiving Mallory's ill-fated letter, he hadn't exchanged a word with her. He wanted to express his pain and anger at the top of his lungs, for the whole world to witness his suffering. He wanted to let the tears flow, to wash away all the accumulated bitterness. He longed to know how long Mallory had planned to hide this terrible truth from him. Was she going to wait until the child was an adult, to perhaps then reveal the truth? Or was she planning to keep silent forever? But deep down, he understood the real reason for sending that letter. It wasn't addressed to him, but to herself. It was her way of starting fresh, freeing herself from the heavy burden of guilt while avoiding the real consequences of her actions. The protagonist reached for his phone, resting on the nearby table, and indulged in a nostalgic journey through the archives of personal messages. Eventually, he pulled out the cherished combination of digits from the depths of his memory, once imprinted in his mind with the same clarity as his birth date. It was his ex-wife's number, and since their breakup, he had never dared to dial it. Now, his finger hovered over the virtual call button, as if over a gaping abyss. He felt conflicted. On one hand, he didn't want to hear her voice, fearing that its timbre would awaken a dormant hurricane of emotions. On the other, He wasn't sure of himself. He was afraid that his own voice would betray the full depth of his emotional wound and despair. In the end, he decided to send a short but poignant text message. "We need to meet and talk face to face. Please, don't bring him." After sending the message, he fixated his gaze on the phone screen, awaiting a reply. The typing indicator appeared and disappeared, as if she were deliberating over each word before erasing it and starting anew. But then, complete silence descended. No reply came. Time stretched agonizingly slow. 5 minutes turned into 10, and each second felt like an eternity. Unable to bear the tension, he angrily threw the phone onto the couch and covered his face with his hands, trying to quell the trembling that seized his body. The call came 20 agonizing minutes later, sudden and sharp. Breaking the silence, her number flashed on the screen. Her voice was quiet, even, almost lifeless, as if she was trying to speak softly, so as not to disturb anyone's sleep. "I agree to meet," she said. "Tomorrow, but only for 10 minutes, and it won't change anything." However, those words had already changed everything. Her message itself, her return call, had turned his world upside down, planting a seed of hope in his wounded soul. The next day, their meeting took place on a dilapidated park bench, serving as an unspoken border between past and present, between the neighborhood of their shared youth and the uncertainty of the future. She appeared in dark glasses, concealing her gaze, despite the leaden clouds that overcast the sky. Fatigue shadowed her face, the paleness of her skin contrasting with her disheveled hair and a careless stain visible on her cardigan sleeve. For the first time in years, she appeared before him imperfect, stripped of her usual polish, which unexpectedly restored her humanity and vulnerability. Without wasting time on empty preambles, he got straight to the point. "I want a test," he said, his voice resolute. She didn't answer immediately, focusing on picking at a loose thread on her sleeve, as if it were a matter of utmost importance. Then, as if shedding a heavy burden, she said, "I knew you'd say that. I was ready for it." "What are you suggesting?" he asked bitterly. "Show up at the lab and spring it on Curtis that the child he's raising might not be his?" Irritated, he added, "Curtis has nothing to do with this. This is about me. This might be my child." "It's not fair," she whispered, a plea in her voice. "None of this is fair," he cut in. "I mourned a woman for 2 years who didn't even bother to properly bury me, just erased me from her life. And now you're saying I might have missed my son's first steps, his first words, his first smiles?" "Stop," she pleaded, but he was unrelenting. "Why? Because you're hurting? And I haven't been hurting all this time." She turned away, and he noticed the tremor in her hand, gripping the edge of her sweater. He saw her holding back tears, saw her lips tremble. But, as always, she didn't let them escape. He had always hated this ability of hers to build impenetrable walls, to shut herself off from the world, to force a fake smile and pretend the ground wasn't falling out from under her feet. "I didn't want to ruin anyone's life," she whispered, barely audible. "You already did," he retorted harshly, and a suffocating silence fell, filled with unspoken pain and mutual accusations. A stifling silence hung in the room, as if all words had already been spoken. But unexpectedly, the woman pulled a photograph from her coat pocket. It was a small Polaroid snapshot, capturing a boy named Cedar in a sandbox. In his hand was a bright green plastic dinosaur. The boy was looking up at someone standing above him, and his face was lit up by a wide, carefree smile. His tousled hair, chubby cheeks, and lively deep eyes were captivating. "Tell me those aren't your eyes, Elwood," she said, and for the first time her voice held pain and uncertainty. He carefully took the photograph. As if holding a fragile relic, he gazed at the boy's features for a long time, and something inside him broke. It was neither grief nor anger, but something far more destructive. A terrifying, almost unbearable hope. Hope that he still had something worth fighting for, something that would fill his existence with meaning. "Get the test," he said firmly. Then he stood up abruptly and left, without looking back, so as not to lose his remaining composure, so that this fragile hope wouldn't completely break him. The burden of waiting and the oppressive uncertainty almost broke him. 12 unending, torment-filled, and exhausting days it took to get the test results. 12 days stretched into an eternity. During that time, his concentration eluded him. Thoughts slipped away, not lingering in his mind. Work became impossible. His brain refused to obey. Sleep fled from him. Nightmares and anxious thoughts tormented his soul. He couldn't sit still long enough to eat a simple sandwich. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boy's face, his wide, curious eyes, his cheeks, childishly plump and round. He remembered the laughter, heard only once from afar, but etched into his memory forever. Endless questions tormented him, questions to which, he knew, no one could provide an answer. Would he love dinosaurs, as he himself had at that age? Or would he have completely different interests? Would he sleep on his side, like him, or choose a different position? Would loud noises scare him, or would he be fearless? Did he even realize who he was, or was he just a stranger to him? When the long-awaited envelope with the results finally arrived by mail, he just sat and stared at it for an hour, not daring to open it. The ordinary, unremarkable white envelope felt incredibly light, as if it contained nothing. He didn't understand why he expected it to weigh more, to be heavier. Perhaps because it contained the future, or at least the version of the future he had so carefully and quietly built in his head. The moment his fingers touched the edge of the envelope, he knew opening it would change something inside, forever. He just didn't know what part of him would survive this. What part of his soul would withstand this blow? The probability left no doubt. 99.9% confirmed paternity. This was his son, his own flesh and blood. Contrary to expectations, tears didn't gush, no hysteria ensued, and no objects flew against the walls. He simply froze on the kitchen's tiled floor, clinging to this astonishing truth that had burst into his life uninvited. The question gnawed at his mind. How long had she kept this secret? How long had she carried his child, living with him under the same roof in their shared home, and said nothing? This thought was almost unbearable. Instinctively, he dialed her number, but only silence answered. A second call also yielded no result. Seeing no other option, he headed to her house. Curtis opened the door. His face showed no surprise, but rather resignation and detachment, as if he had long foreseen this inevitable moment. He froze in the doorway, his faded gaze stripped of its former self-assurance. He looked exhausted, as if fatherhood had turned out to be far from the glossy social media picture. "She's not here," he said in a colorless voice. "Then we'll talk," he cut in, his voice resolute. Curtis remained motionless, merely leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I know," he said. His words caught him off guard. "What do you know?" came the question. "That he's your son," he replied, without flinching, his gaze direct and cold. "I always knew." A deafening silence fell after his words, as if a powerful volcanic eruption had swallowed all surrounding sounds. Something inside him broke. A fragile support crumbled without thunder or screeching, quietly and irrevocably. It was like a heavy door, forever cutting him off from the past. He couldn't comprehend what he had heard. The words seemed meaningless, like an incoherent string of sounds. He desperately wanted him to repeat his words, explain them, admit the monstrous mistake, but he remained silent, continuing in a monotonous, emotionless voice. "She told me before he was born, said he might not be mine. But I didn't care, you know. I promised to raise him, to accept him as my own, even if he looks like you. I'll manage. You meant nothing to me. You were just a nobody." He involuntarily took a step forward, his fist trembling with suppressed anger. "Nothing? You're talking about me, the biological father of this child?" he asked bitterly. "Do you think biological relation makes you a father?" he retorted sharply. "Where were you when he had a fever at 3 a.m, and I hadn't slept for days? Where were you when he couldn't fall asleep without a lullaby? Do you think you can just come in and rewrite what has long been written? What we've built? You stole him." "She gave him to me," he replied calmly, as if throwing shards of ice in his face. He couldn't breathe, couldn't look away. His body trembled. He had raised his child, knowing the truth, aware of every step he took. And she had allowed him to. "You could have told me," he whispered in a broken voice, revealing the full depth of his despair. "Both of you could have." "We don't owe you anything, Elwood," his interlocutor interrupted coldly, his gaze icy. "She left. You stopped being a part of her life, a part of our family." "But I was supposed to be a part of this," he cried out, his voice trembling. Curtis looked him straight in the eyes and uttered words that would be etched in his memory forever. "Maybe you should have fought harder before she left home, leaving you behind." He sharply turned and left the meeting place, without a word. The walk back to the car felt unconscious, as if his legs moved of their own accord. Memories of driving through the city streets were blurred, his mind shrouded in a haze of shock. Only one thing remained clearly etched in his memory: the realization of the scale of the deception that Mallory and Curtis had built around him. They had created their own world, built on a foundation of lies, and left him outside of it, like a dangerous threat requiring isolation. However, now he held the truth, and this truth weighed an unbearable burden. He was no longer just an ex-husband whose existence had been erased from the lives of others. Now he was a father, and he faced the most important decision of his life. The man naively believed that knowing the truth would empower him incredibly, as if the DNA results would unlock a source of righteous, unstoppable energy within him. He imagined himself, armed with this evidence, attaching it to an official legal document and triumphantly entering the courtroom, full of determination to fight for his rights. But the truth, as it turned out, doesn't come with an instruction manual. It brings with it a heaviness, an overwhelming fear, and an empty, nagging pain that makes him doubt every step and wonder if he is worthy of what he has just discovered. In the end, he never filed the legal documents, not yet. Instead, the man sat, as if chained to the cursed piece of paper, as if it were radioactive, and every touch burned him. And every time he tried to think about his next steps, his mind returned to the agonizing question, what if his son doesn't want to know him? What if he remains a stranger to him forever? Since their fleeting meeting in the park, Mallory had seemingly vanished into thin air, plunging the protagonist into a torment of bitter revelations. Curtis, evidently, sought to erase him from his life, like an unwanted ghost from the past. But most of all, the protagonist's soul was torn by the thought of the child, an innocent creature caught in this complex web of relationships, who didn't even suspect the existence of his father. His own son was growing up, believing another man to be his parent, and he was forced to watch from afar, feeling his heart break from pain and helplessness. The protagonist realized the pity and insignificance of his situation, hated this weakness. But 3 weeks after that fateful meeting in the park, he made a decision. Perhaps not the wisest, but the only one that could bring some relief. He wrote a letter, a real one, by hand, without silly cards, pouring all his feelings and remaining hope into it. In this message, there were no threats, no legal claims, only a sincere admission. The protagonist assured Mallory that he had no intention of destroying their world, but merely desperately wished to see his son, just once, without undue expectations or pressure. Just a short conversation, a fleeting glimpse into his life. The reply came 2 days later, in a short message. Saturday, 11 a.m., Marlow Park. Come alone. The moment his car pulled into the parking lot, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over him, as if he had stepped into his own long-forgotten dream that had suddenly become real. The bright sun seemed to mock him with its inappropriate cheerfulness. Everywhere, on the emerald carpet of grass, families were gathered. Children, their laughter ringing out, swung on swings. Parents, clutching coffee cups, sat on benches, offering strained, unnatural smiles. He parked his car as far as possible from the playground, trying to avoid unnecessary attention, and moved forward with slow, hesitant steps, carefully examining each face for familiar features. And then he saw them. Mallory, with her knees pulled to her chest, sat beneath the shade of a sprawling tree, looking more fragile and lost than he remembered. Beside her, directly on the grass, sat the boy, tightly clutching a bright red toy truck in one hand and a juice box in the other. Cedar, his son, he didn't lift his head as he approached, completely engrossed in his play. Mallory, however, looked up. No welcoming gesture, no smile, just a restrained, tense nod. He carefully sat down beside them, trying not to cross an invisible boundary. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, beating a rhythm he hadn't known existed. "Hi," he said softly, his voice sounding alien, uncertain. Cedar looked up. His large, deep blue eyes stared at him. His eyes. "Who's that?" he asked, turning to Mallory. She hesitated, her gaze darting to him. That's an old friend," she said with a strained tone. "Your friend?" he repeated, and then, looking him directly in the eyes for the first time, with childlike spontaneity added, "You don't look like a friend. You look like a stranger." That word, stranger, hit him like a punch to the gut, stealing his breath. Stranger, that's what he was. A stranger to his own flesh and blood. To his own child, he forced a weak, unnatural smile. "I guess so," he mumbled. "You have trucks?" Cedar asked, pointing to his own. "I used to," he replied with a slight sadness in his voice. but not as cool as this one." The boy studied him carefully, his gaze serious and evaluating, 3 seconds of absolute silence that felt like an eternity. Then, losing interest, he returned to his juice. Mallory was silent. So was he. They just sat there. 3 broken people, sitting on the grass, like a ridiculous, agonizing mistake that no one wanted to admit or take responsibility for. For 20 long minutes, he silently watched him play. Only 2 questions were asked by him in an attempt to establish some connection, to which he received 3 concise and dismissive answers. And then, at some point, the boy looked up and, with childlike frankness, said, "Your shoelace is weird." This, strangely enough, was the most open and sincere display of contact between them the entire time. Then Mallory slowly stood up, brushed the grass off her jeans, and glancing at him, said, "Well, it's time to go. We should leave." He didn't object, didn't beg her to stay, didn't try to prolong this fleeting moment. He just nodded in response and slowly stood up. As she gathered his toys and belongings, he knelt beside him again, and quietly, almost in a whisper, said, "Maybe we'll see each other again sometime, buddy." The child didn't reply, continuing to play intently. But as they were leaving, and their silhouettes had almost disappeared around the bend in the path, he suddenly turned and unexpectedly shouted one word that pierced him to the core. "Bye, stranger!" He stood, as if petrified, struck by that word. Stranger. It echoed in his chest, like a heavy door slamming shut forever, cutting him off from the boy's world. He had met his son, his own blood, but to him he remained merely a fleeting visitor in his nascent life. A whole week had passed since that memorable morning in the park, a week filled with the haunting echo of a single word, stranger. It followed him everywhere, creeping into his dreams, heard in the monotonous whistle of the kettle, appearing in fleeting pauses between fragmented thoughts, when he desperately tried to concentrate. And he knew that there was no malice or deliberate insult in that word. It was just childlike spontaneity, a sincere reflection of his perception of the world. And truthfully, the child was right. He was a stranger, an ephemeral ghost, momentarily intruding into the boy's bright, sunny world, leaving only a fleeting shadow on the emerald grass. But even ghosts, even those who have long left the world of the living, remember the warmth of the sun on their skin. He resisted the urge to contact her again immediately, convincing himself of the need for delicacy, to avoid being intrusive. He had to give her and the boy the necessary space. He told himself that a fleeting moment, 20 minutes of watching toy cars roll in the dirt, should be enough. But grief, as he soon realized, doesn't always manifest in loud sobs and desperate cries. Sometimes it quietly nests in the chest, heavy and oppressive, patiently awaiting its hour. And then, after a few agonizing days, his phone suddenly vibrated, signaling a new message from Mallory. Just one line, but it turned his whole existence upside down. "Cedar keeps asking when the man with the weird shoelaces is coming back." He reread the message again and again, trying to convince himself that he had misunderstood, that he had read it wrong. But it wasn't so. It was an invitation, or at least a slightly ajar door into his world. It was decided to try again. The same park was chosen, but this time a more secluded spot, away from curious eyes. As a gift, he brought a toy fire truck, painted a striking red, and equipped with realistic, deafening sirens. The child was genuinely delighted by the toy, Perhaps his joy was caused not so much by the giver as by the fire truck. But at this stage, that was quite enough. With eyes burning with excitement, he immediately asked what sounds real fire trucks made. Without losing a second, a comical, deliberately exaggerated siren sound was made, with the aim of making the maximum impression. The child burst into ringing, sincere laughter, from which he dropped his juice box, spilling it on the grass. The second meeting lasted a full hour. The third meeting lasted almost 2 hours, and by the fourth meeting, the child began to call his visitor Fire Truck Guy. This nickname was accepted with joy and gratitude. He held on to it as something sacred, as something incredibly important, because in a certain sense, the giver was no longer a stranger, a ghost from the past. He had become something concrete, a part of the child's vocabulary, a part of his memory, an integral part of his Saturdays. Curtis, undoubtedly, was not thrilled with what was happening, which was clearly evident from his facial expression. One day, when he arrived to pick up Cedar after another father-son meeting, his tension was almost palpable, despite all attempts to hide his true emotions. Not a word was exchanged between the men, only restrained nods, full of politeness, but also with noticeable caution. It seemed they both held the ends of a thin thread, stretched to its limit, ready to snap at the slightest wrong move. In Curtis's eyes, uncertainty was visible, and perhaps the first signs of fear. However, the narrator's driving force was by no means a desire for revenge. He had no wish to destroy the role Curtis played in Cedar's life, no desire to usurp his place. His only aspiration was to find his own place, to define his own role in his son's life. And strangely enough, Mallory showed understanding. She seemed to grasp the sincerity of his intentions. Now, invitations extended beyond just visiting the park. He was given the opportunity to visit playgrounds, join story time at the library, and together they visited the Science Museum, where Cedar enthusiastically looked at rockets and everything related to them. Cedar loved ketchup, adding it to almost any dish, couldn't stand loud noises in restrooms, and was thrilled by popping bubble wrap, accompanying it with funny sounds. Every week, the father discovered something new about his son, about his little world. But at the same time, every week the narrator lived in constant fear that this fragile bridge they were building could be destroyed at any moment. Fortunately, his fears were unfounded. On the contrary, their relationship continued to develop, albeit slowly, unevenly, like a flower planted too late, but determined to bloom against all odds. One quiet day, as they sat on the floor of a bookstore, engrossed in colorful illustrations about the lives of sea turtles, the boy unexpectedly touched his hand. The child's voice was almost a whisper, and without looking up from the pictures, he said, "You seem like a daddy." The words caught the man off guard, leaving him speechless. A lump in his throat made it hard to breathe, as if an invisible hand had squeezed him. His heart gave a painful lurch. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold back involuntary tears, hoping the boy wouldn't notice his confusion. But the child's gaze didn't miss the change in his face. "Are you crying?" he asked with undisguised curiosity. "No, of course not," the man quickly reassured him, clearing his throat. "I just have an allergy to turtle books." The boy laughed merrily, shook his head as if he were the funniest person in the world, and re-immersed himself in reading. This simple sentence became the thread that connected the fragments of his soul, healing old wounds They are still adjusting to the new reality. There are no ready-made instructions or rules for such relationships. The man still doesn't know what to call their bond, this unusual but so important connection. The future is still unclear, and it's unknown what challenges they will face. But now, when the boy sees him on the street, he no longer shouts, "Stranger!" He runs towards him, arms outstretched, and joyfully shouts another word that fills the man's heart with inexpressible happiness. "Daddy!" And every time he catches him in his arms, he feels that he has found his place in this world, found a true home.